The Galactic Council turned on humanity and awakened a fury they couldn't contain. Part 1: The Verdict. The vote was already decided before I walked into the chamber. I knew it the moment I crossed the threshold and saw the way the Vethra delegate looked at me. Not with hostility. Not with guilt. With the quiet, settled calm of someone who has already finished a task and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Councillor Dreth, tall, pale-scaled, with those flat amber eyes that never blinked enough, looked at me the way you look at a wall you are about to paint over. My name is Kale Voss. I was, at that moment, the sole human representative on the floor of the Galactic Council. I had held that position for 6 years. I had argued for humanity, bled politically for humanity, and given up everything that resembled a personal life for humanity. And in the next 22 minutes, all of it would mean nothing. The chamber itself was enormous. The Galactic Council Central Hall on Station Verith Prime seated representatives from 41 recognized species, their seats arranged in a curved tier that rose around a central speaking floor. The architecture was designed to make whoever stood on that floor feel small. The ceiling stretched so high above that the top of it disappeared into a soft artificial haze. Every surface was polished pale stone that caught the light and threw it back cold and clean. I had given speeches in this hall over 100 times. I had never once stopped feeling the weight of it. I took my seat at the human delegations table. My aide, a young man named Colin Farr, leaned close and whispered that the preliminary session had already run longer than scheduled. He said it like that was unusual. It wasn't. The council ran long when they were stalling. The session opened. High Speaker Naval of the Vethra Collective called the chamber to order in that slow, resonant voice of his, the kind of voice that sounded like it was reading from a sacred text even when it was reading a lunch order. He announced that the council had reached a resolution regarding humanity's standing under the Galactic Accord. He used the word resolution the way a judge uses the word ruling. I asked for the floor. My request was acknowledged and immediately deferred. That was the first crack in the wall. Then they read the terms. Humanity's protected status under the Galactic Accord was to be suspended indefinitely. The reason cited was a formal finding of unresolvable behavioral instability, documented across a 40-page report that I had never been shown, compiled over 18 months by a committee I had never been invited to address. Our trade lanes through sectors 7 through 14 were to be closed to human vessels pending a security review that had no stated end date. Our 3 outer colonies, Halcyon Station, the Brennan Belt settlements, and New Cairo on the edge of the Dreen boundary, were to be transferred to Vethra administrative oversight, effective in 30 standard days. That last part was where my hands went still on the table. Administrative oversight. That was the phrase they used. 40,000 human civilians living in those colonies, and the council had just handed their homes to the Vethra Collective without asking a single one of them. Without asking me. I stood up. I did not wait for the floor. There is a rule in the Galactic Council that an affected party must be given the opportunity to respond before a resolution is finalized. It is in the Accord. I cited the clause number out loud across the chamber floor. High Speaker Naval looked at me with those amber eyes and said the response period had been conducted in writing during the preliminary phase. I said I had submitted no written response because I had not been notified of a preliminary phase. He said the notification had been sent through standard diplomatic channels. I said I had received nothing. He said that was noted for the record. And then my audio channel cut out. Not a malfunction. A deliberate cut. Colin reached for the emergency broadcast node at our table and found it locked. I looked around the chamber at 41 species watching me stand at a muted console with nowhere to send my voice. A few of the delegates looked away. Most did not bother. The vote was called. It passed 9-0, with 3 abstentions, the Sarati, the Umval, and the Dreen. The Dreen had not attended in person. Their abstention was submitted remotely, which for the Dreen was the equivalent of a loud statement. They simply preferred the rest of the galaxy not to understand it yet. High Speaker Naval thanked the chamber for its time. I stood there for a moment with my channel still muted and the vote already logged into the permanent record. Colin put his hand on my arm. I did not move. I was looking at the Vethra delegate, and he was looking at me, and neither of us spoke, but we both understood exactly what had just happened. This was not a ruling born from fear of what humanity might do. This was a business arrangement. Our solar system, sitting on a gravitational anomaly that made it the perfect hub for a faster-than-light relay network, was worth more to the Council without us in it. We were not a threat. We were property. And property does not get a vote. A council attendant, a small bird-framed Sarati clerk, approached our table and placed a physical document in front of me. It was the formal copy of the resolution. Below the text was a space for the human delegate's acknowledgement signature. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. They wanted my handwriting on their document. They wanted me to confirm I had been present. I looked at that line for a long time. Then I reached into my coat pocket and found the emergency relay chip I had been carrying for 4 years, since the first time I had noticed the council's sanctions discussions getting serious. It was a single burst transmitter, good for one short message, capable of punching through most standard signal interference. I had never used it. I pressed the chip against the underside of the table, away from the chamber's sensors, and I sent one word to Earth. Remember. Then I signed the document. Not because I accepted the terms. Because my signature on that document was evidence. If this ever went before an independent arbitration panel, if such a thing ever existed again, I wanted a record that humanity's representative had been present, had been silenced, and had been handed the resolution as a finished product. My signature was not consent. It was a timestamp. Colin and I were escorted from the chamber by 2 Vethra security officers. Politely. That was the part that stayed with me longest on the transit ride back to the docking ring, how polite they were. How calm the whole thing had been. No confrontation. No noise. A clean, quiet act of erasure. At the docking ring, before we boarded the transport, I stopped and looked back through the long corridor window at the council chamber's exterior spire. And then I watched something I had not expected. 2 Vethra attendants emerged onto the exterior balcony. They were carrying the ceremonial flags of each represented species, arranging them in a formal display, a council tradition after major resolutions. When they reached humanity's flag, the deep blue and white banner I had walked past every working day for 6 years, they did not hang it. They folded it. Carefully, precisely, with the kind of practiced efficiency that told me this was not the first time they had rehearsed the motion. They folded it into a tight triangle and carried it back inside. That image was broadcast live on the council's public channel. I later learned it reached 78 star systems within the hour. Colin asked me what we were going to do. I thought about the word I had just sent home. I thought about the 4 years I had been quietly watching, quietly noting, quietly learning exactly which members of this council had decided humanity was expendable and why. I thought about every late-night conversation I had ever had with Admiral Yaroshen, back on Earth, about contingencies. And I said, we are going to go home. Because that was where it started. Part 2, The Reckoning begins. Earth did not look the way I expected it to look. I had half prepared myself, somewhere in the back of my mind, for chaos. For crowds outside the transit terminals, for broadcast screens showing the council's announcement on a loop, for the particular kind of public noise that comes when a planet receives bad news. I had been through enough diplomatic crises to know how civilian panic moves, fast, loud, and sideways. What I found instead was quiet. Not the quiet of shock. Not the quiet of grief. The quiet of people who had already known this was coming and had spent the intervening time deciding what they were going to do about it. Colin and I cleared customs at the Cape Town terminal and stepped into a city that was moving with careful, deliberate speed. There were no crowds in the streets. The broadcast screens were not showing the council's announcement. They were showing logistics feeds, cargo routes, manufacturing output numbers, orbital docking schedules. The kind of content that usually ran at 3 in the morning when nobody was watching. At 7 in the evening on the day humanity lost its standing in the Galactic Council, Cape Town's Port Authority was running at 140% capacity and nobody was talking about why. A government transport was waiting for me at the terminal exit. The driver, a composed woman in her 40s named Grace Holloway, handed me a single printed card as I got in. No name on it. Just a location code and a time. 40 minutes, she said. I looked at the card. The location code corresponded to a facility in the Karoo interior that did not appear on any map I had ever been given clearance to access. How long has this meeting been scheduled? I asked her. She glanced at me in the mirror. 18 months. I sat back and said nothing for the rest of the drive. The facility was built into a hillside. From the outside it looked like an agricultural research station, low buildings, solar arrays, a few standard access roads. Inside it was something else entirely. 3 levels underground, a command infrastructure that could have run a small war, and more people moving with more purpose than I had seen anywhere outside of an active military operation. Admiral Yarashin met me in a corridor on the 2nd level down. She was 53, compact, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who does not waste movement. She had commanded the 5th Expeditionary Arm before accepting the appointment that officially, on paper, made her the head of Earth's Planetary Defense Review Board. A position that sounded administrative. A position that was not. She shook my hand, looked at me for a moment, and said, "You sent the word." "I sent it," I said. She nodded once. "Good. Then we are on schedule." She walked me through the facility over the next 2 hours, and what she showed me rearranged everything I thought I understood about the past 4 years. The program was called Iron Cradle. It did not exist in any official budget. It did not exist in any defense white paper, any parliamentary record, or any document that had ever been shared with a council inspection team. It existed because 6 years ago, a small group of people had looked at the direction the council's internal discussions were moving and had made a decision. If the galaxy ever decided humanity was a problem to be managed, humanity would not be caught unprepared. Iron Cradle was a manufacturing network. Distributed, embedded, and entirely invisible to outside observation. Production nodes in the asteroid belt. Assembly platforms on the dark side of Luna. Fuel processing facilities inside hollowed-out minor bodies in the outer system, disguised as survey operations. Every piece of it built by human hands, funded through layers of redirected civilian contracts, and connected by a communications web that ran on frequencies the Council's monitoring systems had never been designed to detect. What they had built, in the dark, over 6 years, was a fleet. Not a large fleet, by the standards of the elder species. Not the kind of overwhelming force that the Vethra Collective could field, with their centuries of accumulated warship production. But a precise fleet. A thoughtful fleet. Ships designed not by committees trying to satisfy every tactical doctrine simultaneously, but by engineers who had studied every engagement record humanity had access to and asked one question: what works? Yara showed me the vessel classifications on a display that covered an entire wall of the briefing room. I stood in front of it and read quietly for several minutes. "The Council's inspection teams," I said finally. "They've run 3 audits of our military capacity in the last 4 years. They audited what we showed them," Yara said. "And this was somewhere else." I turned away from the display. "How many people know enough to build it?" "Fewer than you'd think." She crossed her arms. "The people who built this, Kale, they didn't do it for money or promotion. They did it because they understood what was at stake. People don't talk about something like this. They just work." I spent the night in the facility. I did not sleep much. I sat with the briefing documents and went through them methodically, the way I go through anything, linearly, from the beginning, not skipping ahead even when I wanted to. I needed to understand not just what existed, but how it had been kept quiet, and how long it could remain so. The answer to the second question was, not much longer. Iron Cradle had been designed for a specific window. A moment when it would need to either be used or be dismantled. That window, Yara told me the next morning over coffee in the facility's small canteen, had just opened. "What do you need from me?" I asked her. "Time," she said. And allies. That was the second part of the brief. The fleet was the muscle. But muscle without cover is just a target. Humanity needed to fracture the Council's coalition before the Council finished converting its resolution into active enforcement measures. We had, by Yara's estimate, 40 to 60 days before the Vethra administrative teams arrived at the outer colonies. After that, it became something else. Something harder to walk back. I was given a new assignment. Not ambassador, that title was gone with our protected status. My new role had no formal name. What I was, in practical terms, was the person who needed to go talk to the 3 species that had abstained from the vote, the Serati, the Umval, and the Dreen. The Serati were pragmatic traders. Their abstention had not been moral, it had been commercial. They traded heavily with human colony systems, and the Council's blockade hurt their shipping margins. That was a conversation about numbers, and I knew how to have it. The Umval were harder to read. They were a quiet, philosophical species with a long memory and a deep aversion to what they called institutional excess. Their abstention might mean they believed the Council had overreached. Or it might mean nothing at all. I would need to find out. The Dreen were a different category entirely. Nobody in living memory had held a face-to-face meeting with a Dreen representative. Their abstention had been submitted remotely and without comment. They were ancient, older than the council itself, and almost nothing about their intentions was ever clear. Reaching them was not a diplomatic task. It was an expedition. My preparation for those conversations took 10 days. During those 10 days, I watched the first real sign that the rest of the galaxy was paying attention. A human cargo vessel named the Farwell Cross, running a legitimate supply route to Halcyon Station before the blockade formally closed, encountered a Vethra patrol ship in Sector 9 that ordered it to stop and submit to inspection. The Farwell Cross's captain, a man named Owen Bray who had been flying that route for 11 years and had exactly 0 patience left for anything, responded by simply not stopping. He pushed his engines to their mechanical limit and went through the patrol line at a speed that left the Vethra ship well behind before it had finished issuing its second warning. The council logged it as an incident. They issued a formal protest to the Earth government demanding Captain Bray's license be suspended and a formal apology be submitted within 72 hours. Earth's response arrived in 69 hours. It was 3 sentences long. It acknowledged receipt of the protest. It noted that Captain Bray had been operating on a route opened before the blockade resolution's effective date and had therefore broken no law that existed at the time. It expressed hope that the council would clarify its procedures for future reference. No apology. No suspension. Colin, reading the response over my shoulder in the briefing room, let out a sound that was almost a laugh. "They're changing tone," he said. "They decided their tone before I landed," I said. "I think we decided ours a long time ago too. We just weren't saying it out loud yet." My transport to the first meeting, with the Serati shadow broker on neutral station Archith, was ready 2 days later. I packed light. 1 bag, 1 case of documents, and the single most important piece of information I had pulled from the briefing files, the council's real reason for the resolution. Buried in the 40-page report they had never shown me, in a section labeled as a technical appendix on solar system cartography, was a survey note that had nothing to do with humanity's behavioral index. It was a gravitational mapping report. It showed Earth's solar system sitting directly on a natural alignment of deep space gravity wells that, if properly utilized, could serve as the anchor point for a faster-than-light relay network of a range and efficiency that would make current FTL travel look primitive. The Council did not want humanity removed because we were dangerous. They wanted the address. And they wanted it without us in it. That piece of paper was the most powerful thing I carried onto that transport. Because when I showed it to the right people, it would not just fracture the Council's coalition. It would tell the entire galaxy exactly what kind of institution the Galactic Council had become. The transport lifted. I watched Earth fall away below the viewport, and I thought about Owen Bray not stopping for the patrol ship, and I thought about 6 years of iron and silence built in the dark by people who believed in something they were never asked to prove. The reckoning had begun. Quietly. With intention. And with far more behind it than anyone outside this solar system understood yet. Part 3, What We Are Made Of. The Serati broker's name was Fana Rail, and she met me in the back room of a transit-side canteen on neutral station Archith with a cup of something hot and the immediate energy of someone who had been waiting impatiently for 3 days. She was small by Serati standards, lean, with the feathered ridge along her jawline that indicated high-caste merchant lineage, and she wasted exactly no time on pleasantries. She looked at the document I placed on the table, read it in approximately 90 seconds, then looked up at me with an expression I had not expected from a species known for its composure. She looked genuinely unsettled. "How long have they known about this alignment?" she asked. "The survey was commissioned 4 years ago," I said. "The Council received the final report 14 months ago. Their resolution against humanity came 12 months after that." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the canteen's narrow window, the station's transit corridors were full of movement, cargo haulers, passenger transports, the ordinary mechanical noise of a neutral port doing ordinary business. In here, the quiet between us carried more weight than the noise outside. "If they build that relay network," she said slowly, "they control every major trade route in the western arm of the galaxy." "They control more than trade routes," I said. "They control who gets where, when, and how fast." Every species that currently operates independently of the Vethra collective shipping lanes would become dependent on infrastructure the Vethra own. The Serati included. She looked at the document again. She did not pick it up. She studied it the way you study something you are deciding whether to touch. "What do you want from us?" she said. "A formal withdrawal from the Council coalition," I said. "Not a military commitment. Not an alliance. A statement of procedural objection on the record, citing the same clause I cited on the council floor before my channel was cut. It creates a legal basis for independent review. It slows them down. It makes us a target. You are already a target, I said. You just don't know the shape of it yet. She picked up the document. 11 days later, the Sarati Merchant Combine issued a formal statement of withdrawal from the Council's enforcement coalition, citing evidence of procedural misconduct and undisclosed commercial motivation in the drafting of Resolution 7 Theta. The statement was sent to every species with observer status in the Galactic Accord. It was 2 pages long, precise, and devastating. The UMBL responded to my outreach through their Cultural Liaison Office on Station Verith with a message that was, by UMBL standards, extremely direct. They would observe developments and respond in time. I took that as a cautious positive. By the time I was back aboard my transport and heading toward the coordinates where I hoped to make contact with the Dreen, a process so uncertain that Yara had told me simply to try and to report back whatever happened, the news from home was accelerating. The Vethra Administrative Advance Team sent to establish a presence at Halcyon Station received a communication from the station's governing council, 37 elected civilians, including farmers, engineers, and a retired school teacher named Lena Rowe who served as station mayor, informing them that the station was not accepting administrative transfers that had not been ratified by a vote of the station's residents. Lena Rowe's statement was 4 sentences long and perfectly polite. It mentioned nothing about force. It was simply an accurate description of the station's internal governance charter, which predated the Galactic Accord by 9 years. The Vethra team held position outside the docking approach and filed a complaint with the council. The council filed a response with Earth demanding the station comply. Earth acknowledged receipt of the demand. Nothing else moved. It was a bureaucratic standstill, and every day it held was a day Iron Cradle spent completing its readiness checks. Then the Vethra Collective changed its approach. 32 warships. The council called it a peacekeeping deployment. The official communication described it as a stabilization presence, intended to facilitate the smooth transition of the outer colonies to administrative oversight. 32 ships, the largest single non-combat fleet the Council had assembled since the Accord's founding, moving in organized formation toward the Mars defense perimeter. It was designed to be seen. That was the point. They wanted the images of that fleet moving through space to reach every screen on Earth and in every human colony simultaneously. They wanted the scale of it to do the talking. They wanted humanity to look at 32 warships and understand, without anyone having to say it plainly, that resistance was not a realistic option. I was in transit when the fleet crossed into the outer system. Colin sent me the sensor report in real time. I read the ship classifications carefully. Vethra heavy cruisers, collective support vessels, 2 command ships broadcasting council resolution codes on their transponders. Textbook intimidation formation. Spread out enough to look overwhelming, concentrated enough to respond quickly to anything they encountered. What they encountered at the Mars perimeter was not what they had planned for. The 7th Human Expeditionary Arm had been repositioned 3 weeks earlier. Not publicly. Not loudly. Yara had moved them in increments, using standard rotation orders, the kind of paperwork that generates no flags in any monitoring system because it happens all the time. By the time the Vethra fleet crossed the outer perimeter, the 7th Arm was already in position, not blocking the approach, not making an aggressive display, just present. Waiting. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. I watched the full sensor record later, in the facility's briefing room, and I watched it twice. Not because it was complicated. Because it was important to understand exactly what happened and why. The Vethra fleet formation held together for approximately the first 90 seconds after the 7th Arm became visible on their sensors. Then the command ship began broadcasting a demand for the human vessels to stand down and allow passage. The 7th Arm's commander, a man named Philip Garrett who I had never met personally but whose record I had read twice through, did not respond to the demand. He did not respond to the second demand either. What he did instead was maneuver his formation into a position that made the Vethra fleet's current approach vector tactically untenable without engagement. It was a precise, silent invitation to recalculate. The Vethra fleet held for 4 minutes. I could imagine the conversations happening inside those command ships, the arguments, the risk assessments, the back and forth between officers who had built their careers on the assumption that the Council's authority was self-enforcing and that no one would genuinely choose to stand against 32 warships. They had not adequately considered what humanity does when standing down is not the choice it intends to make. The exchange that followed was short and conclusive. 3 Vethra vessels made a move that Philip Garrett had apparently anticipated, because his response was immediate and exactly calibrated. Not excessive. Calibrated. 2 of the 3 advancing vessels were disabled with targeted strikes that took out their propulsion and left their hulls intact. The 3rd retreated. The rest of the fleet, watching 2 of their ships go dark in under 30 seconds, began pulling back. 1 Vethra vessel did not read the situation correctly and pushed forward. It was the only ship in the engagement that did not come home. The remaining fleet withdrew. Philip Garrett did not pursue. He held the Mars perimeter and transmitted a single message to the Council: the 7th Human Expeditionary Arm would remain at its current position. Human space would remain human space. The Council's emergency session convened within hours. I had a cracked feed of parts of it by the following morning. What struck me was not the anger in the session. I expected anger. What struck me was the confusion. They had sent 32 ships as a statement, and the statement had come back rewritten. Back at the facility, Yara looked at the engagement report the same way she looked at everything, without expression, with complete attention. "They'll say it was a provocation," she said. "They'll say whatever helps them explain it," I said. "It doesn't matter what they say. What matters is what the rest of the galaxy saw." The rest of the galaxy had seen 32 Council warships sent to demonstrate overwhelming force return home with the clear evidence that the demonstration had not worked. And they had seen it happen in 11 minutes. I returned to Earth from my dream contact attempt with no confirmed meeting, but with something almost more valuable: a response. I had sent a formal diplomatic message through the only known dream communication node, not expecting anything, and received back a single sentence in Old Accord standard script. "Your message has been received and is being considered by those who consider such things." For the dream, that was practically an enthusiastic reply. Colin taped it to the wall of the briefing room. Yara looked at it for a long time. "Keep going," she said. So I did. Part 4, The Fire We Carry. The leak did not come from our side. I want to be precise about that, because the Council later tried to argue that humanity had engineered the disclosure for strategic purposes. We had not. The classified document that changed everything reached the public domain through a Sarati investigative journalist named Ven Calith, working off a tip from a source inside the Vethra administrative apparatus who had apparently developed serious reservations about what they were being asked to do. The document was the Extinction Protocol. It did not use that phrase. Bureaucracies rarely do. What the 43 pages of classified Council procedure described, in careful, formal language, was a biosphere containment directive applicable to Category 7 situations, defined as scenarios in which a species under Council jurisdiction demonstrated military capacity exceeding a threshold classified as Accord incompatible. The directive authorized the use of atmospheric disruption ordnance, a polite term for weapons capable of making a planet's surface uninhabitable, as a final stabilization measure. Earth was named specifically in the annexure. A threshold. A trigger condition. A timeline of 60 days from the date the directive had been quietly signed by a Council subcommittee 3 weeks before I had walked into the chamber and watched my audio channel get cut. The 60-day clock had been running for 23 days by the time the document became public. I was in the facility's communications center when Colin forwarded me the first news broadcast. I read the summary once. I did not read it twice. There was nothing in it that required rereading. I called Yara. She answered immediately, which told me she had already seen it. "How many people know the countdown number?" I asked. "Everyone who needs to," she said. "And Iron Cradle's readiness status?" 91%. The remaining 9% is final targeting calibration and crew orientation on the newest vessels. We need 14 days. We might not have 14 days before they realize we know. "I know," she said. "But we have enough." What happened over the next 72 hours was unlike anything I had ever witnessed in my professional life, and I have spent most of my professional life watching human beings respond to difficult circumstances. I had seen unity before, the managed, fragile kind that exists when leaders agree in rooms and send the results downward to a population that may or may not follow. I had never seen organic unity. The kind that moves from the ground up. The Extinction Protocol reached the public on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday evening, every major government on Earth had issued a statement. Not coordinated statements, I checked the timestamps. They came in from different capitals within a spread of 90 minutes, each one using different words but arriving at the same conclusion. By Wednesday morning, the outer colonies had followed. Halcyon Station's mayor, Lena Rowe, broadcast a statement from the station's public channel that was 7 minutes long and completely without decoration. She described what the document said, what it meant, and what Halcyon Station's residents had decided. They were not leaving. They were not accepting administrative transfer. They were staying, and they were waiting, and they trusted that the people at home were doing what needed to be done. By Wednesday afternoon, I was in a secure session with representatives from every branch of Earth's governance and every major colony council. I did not have to make a speech. The room already knew what it wanted to decide. What they needed from me was the legal certification, the formal diplomatic declaration that would activate Iron Cradle under Galactic law, framing our response not as an act of aggression but as an exercise of a species' right to self-defense under the original text of the Accord, which predated the Council's current membership and had never been formally amended. The original Accord, written when the galaxy was a different kind of place, included a passage that the Council's current leadership had apparently never considered worth worrying about. It stated that a signatory species faced with a formally documented threat to its continued existence retained the right to take all necessary measures for survival, and that such measures could not be classified as violations of the Accord without the unanimous agreement of all original signatories. The Dreen were an original signatory. And the Dreen had not agreed to anything the Council had done in the past 30 years. I prepared the declaration myself. Not because no one else could have written it, but because I had earned the right to be the one who did. 6 years of diplomacy. 6 years of watching and listening and learning the exact shape of what we were dealing with. I knew every clause of the Accord and I knew exactly where to place the argument so it could not be dismantled. I read it aloud in the session before signing it. 400 people in the room. Nobody spoke while I read. When I finished, I signed it and transmitted it simultaneously to every council member, every observer nation, and every neutral station in the known galaxy. Then I waited. Yara activated Iron Cradle the following morning. The fleet that emerged from the asteroid belt and the lunar facilities and the dark, quiet construction platforms that had been running in secret for 6 years did not move the way a fleet moves when it is trying to be noticed. It moved precisely, efficiently, and with the kind of coordinated timing that told any observer watching their sensors that what they were seeing had been rehearsed many times. 412 vessels. The Council's observers, once they recovered from the initial shock of the sensor readings, began attempting to classify the ship types. They could not, because human engineers had not built to any existing classification standard. They had built to their own. Yara named the operation after a figure from ancient mythology. Someone who stole fire from those who believed they alone were allowed to have it and gave it to those who needed it. The name fit. I recorded my broadcast from the facility's communications room. Not a speech, I have never liked the word. A statement. Simple, direct, addressed to every species in the galaxy that was not humanity, and specifically to those who had watched a flag get folded and thought they understood what it meant. I told them what the extinction protocol said. I told them when it had been signed. I told them about the gravitational survey and what the Council had actually wanted from our solar system. I read the relevant section of the original Accord on the record. I named the specific Council members who had signed the subcommittee authorization. I published the full document archive, every piece of evidence we had accumulated over 4 years of quiet watching. And then I said this: humanity was not at war with the galaxy. Humanity was at war with a governing body that had violated its own founding principles in pursuit of a commercial interest, and that had decided the most efficient solution to its problem was to eliminate the people in the way. We were not asking for sympathy. We were asking every neutral party to stay neutral, and we were informing them that we had the means and the intention to defend ourselves under the terms of the original Accord. I ended the broadcast. Colin was standing behind me. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. The Dreen broke their silence the following morning. Not through their communication node. On every major broadcast channel across the known galaxy simultaneously, a signal originating from Dreen-controlled space transmitted a single sentence in 22 languages. Humanity's cause is recognized. 11 words. No elaboration. No context offered. The Dreen clearly understood that the 11 words were sufficient, and they were correct. Because under the original Accord, recognition of a cause by an original signatory was not merely a moral statement. It was a legal classification. It meant that the Dreen formally considered humanity's self-defense action to be covered by the survival clause. It meant the Council could not classify our response as an Accord violation without the Dreen's agreement, and the Dreen had just made their position clear. The Council's emergency session ran for 9 hours. I had a partial feed, enough to follow the structure of the debate without every word. What I observed was the gradual, unmistakable sound of a coalition coming apart at its edges. The smaller council members, the ones who had voted with the Vethra because the political cost of abstaining had felt too high, were now doing the math on a different set of numbers. The Umble had gone fully silent, which their cultural attachés confirmed to 3 separate news organizations meant they were in the process of changing their position. Iron Cradle's fleet crossed the Council's declared exclusion zone boundary at 1400 hours on day 31 of the 60-day countdown. Not at combat speed. At transit speed. Measured, unhurried, and completely visible on every long-range sensor array the Council operated. I was watching the feed when the alarms triggered across 9 Council home systems simultaneously. I listened to the scrambled emergency channel for a few minutes. I heard something I had spent 6 years not quite believing I would ever hear from the species that had folded our flag and cut my microphone and handed 40,000 human civilians to someone else's administration without a second thought. Something that sounded, for the first time, like genuine alarm. Not anger. Not political calculation. Not the measured, formal language of a body that believes it controls the situation. Alarm. The real kind. The kind that comes when the map you have been using turns out to be the wrong map entirely. I thought about Lena Rowe on Halcyon Station, saying calmly that they were staying. I thought about Owen Bray pushing his cargo ship through a patrol line at full speed because he had 11 years of honest work behind him and was not prepared to stop for people who had no right to tell him to. I thought about 6 years of iron built in the dark by people who simply kept working. I closed the feed. I did not need to listen to the alarm any longer. The fire was already lit. Part 5, A New Reckoning. They reached out through back channels first. That was how I knew they were serious. Public diplomacy is theater. Back channels are where the actual conversations happen, where the careful language of official statements gets set aside and the people involved say what they mean. When the Vethra High Speaker's personal aide contacted a Sarati intermediary who contacted a neutral station broker who contacted Colin's secure line at 3 in the morning, I knew the Council was not maneuvering anymore. They were reaching. Colin woke me. I read the message sitting at the edge of my bunk in the facility, still in the dark. They wanted to talk. Not the full Council, too many moving pieces, too much risk of a session becoming a spectacle. The High Speaker and 4 senior delegates. A neutral location. 14 days to arrange it. I forwarded the message to Yara with one question: does 14 days change anything about our position? She responded in 6 minutes. No. Hold. I went back to sleep. Not because I was unconcerned, but because what was coming required clarity, and clarity requires rest, and I had learned a long time ago not to make decisions while tired that I would have to live with while awake. In those 14 days, the galaxy finished choosing sides. The Umble Cultural Council released a formal statement that ran to 11 pages and quoted extensively from the original accord. It concluded by recognizing humanity's self-defense claim, citing the Dream precedent, and adding something of their own, a formal request that an independent review panel be established to examine the circumstances of Resolution 7, Theda's passage. The request carried legal weight because the Umble had been founding participants in the Accord's arbitration framework, a role that had never been formally revoked. 4 smaller Council member species submitted requests for observer status in the arbitration process. That was not a coincidence. It was the political equivalent of publicly moving to a different seat in the room. The Vethra Collective issued 3 increasingly firm public statements insisting that Iron Cradle's deployment violated the Council's peacekeeping provisions, and received back from the Galactic legal community a fairly uniform response. Those provisions applied to Accord members in good standing. A species that had been stripped of its status through a process the Umble and the Sarati had both formally characterized as procedurally deficient occupied an interesting legal position, but it was not obviously bound by rules it had been expelled from the framework for violating in the first place. The lawyers were having a complicated time. The diplomats were having a worse one. And the Council was sitting in a situation it had clearly not planned for. The plan had been for the flag folding to be the end of the conversation. The plan had not accounted for humanity having had a longer, quieter plan of its own. Philip Garrett held the Mars perimeter without incident. Iron Cradle maintained its position at the exclusion zone boundary, not advancing, not retreating. I had specifically requested that posture. Not because we were signaling restraint. Because I wanted the Council's negotiators to arrive at the table having spent 14 days looking at that fleet on their long-range sensors and thinking about what it meant that it had not moved. A thing that is still because it has chosen to be still is more instructive than a thing that is still because it has stopped. The neutral location for the meeting was a facility on Station Archith, the same station where I had met Fana Rail 9 weeks earlier. A coincidence that I appreciated. The conference room they assigned us was clean, unadorned, and exactly the right size for 10 people. No ceremony. No flags. No ceremonial seating arrangement that implied hierarchy. Just a table and chairs and whatever we brought into the room. I brought Colin, Yara, in her capacity as Earth's Defense Command representative, and a legal advisor named Daniel Cord who had spent 15 years studying the original Accord texts and who, when he needed to be, was the most precise person I had ever watched work. I also brought the full document archive, printed and bound, in 4 copies. One for each of us and one for the table. The council delegation arrived 12 minutes late. I had noted, over 6 years of diplomatic meetings, that arriving late to a negotiation you requested is a way of attempting to reclaim a small piece of positional authority. It never works as well as people think it does. What it actually communicates is that you needed to try. High Speaker Naval entered first. He was older than I remembered, or perhaps I was simply seeing him differently now than I had when he sat above me on the council floor and cut my microphone. He moved with the same measured gravity, but the amber eyes that had looked at me with settled finality in the chamber now carried something more complicated. He looked at me across the table. I looked back. "Ambassador Voss," he said. "I'm not an ambassador anymore," I said. "You took care of that. You can call me Kale." A flicker of something crossed his face. He sat down. The other 4 delegates filed in. I recognized 2 of them from the council floor. The other 2 I knew only from briefing documents, Vethra senior administrators who handled the practical side of the collective's territorial operations. They were here because the outer colonies were the most immediate pressure point, and they knew it. I let them settle. I did not open the conversation. I had learned, years ago, that the person who opens a difficult conversation in a room they did not call for is always operating at a slight disadvantage. They had asked for this meeting. I waited. It was the High Speaker who finally said, "The Council is prepared to discuss a path toward de-escalation." I put my hands on the table. "I'm not here to de-escalate," I said. "I'm here to talk about terms." One of the Vethra administrators shifted in his seat. "Terms," the High Speaker repeated slowly. "Terms," I said. "Humanity's terms. For what it will take to return to a state of productive relationship with the Council, understanding that the Council, in its current form and with its current membership, has demonstrated that it cannot be trusted to operate as a neutral governing body. So we are going to talk about structural changes as well as immediate relief." I opened my copy of the document archive to the first marked page and slid it to the center of the table. First, humanity's protected status is restored immediately and unconditionally. Not pending review. Not subject to a compliance period. Immediately. The record reflects that the status was stripped through a procedurally invalid process, as documented in the Umbral Council's formal submission. Restoration is not a concession. It is a correction. The High Speaker looked at the page. The Council would need to vote on. "The Council will vote on it within 72 hours of this meeting," I said. "Not at the next scheduled session. Within 72 hours. That is the timeline." Silence. Second. The outer colonies, Halcyon Station, the Brennan Belt settlements, and New Cairo, are returned to full human jurisdiction immediately. Vethra administrative teams currently positioned near those locations will withdraw within 48 hours. The colony's residents will be notified that the transfer order has been cancelled. Lena Rowe will receive a direct apology from the Vethra Collective, as the individual most publicly affected by an illegitimate order that was never her community's to obey. The Vethra administrator who had shifted earlier opened his mouth. I continued without pausing. Third. The full record of Resolution 7, Theta's passage, every internal communication, every committee session, every document related to the deliberations, is released to the independent arbitration panel the Umbral have requested. Without redaction. The Council's argument that this material is internally privileged does not survive contact with the Extinction Protocol's existence, and we will make that argument in front of any panel they prefer. I turn to the next marked page. Fourth. The Extinction Protocol, the Biosphere Containment Directive, in the language your subcommittee preferred, is not simply withdrawn. It is publicly renounced, on record, by every member of the Council who signed the authorization. Not a general statement of policy revision. Named individuals, named authorization, public renunciation. The Galaxy saw the document. The Galaxy will see that the people who signed it took personal accountability for having done so. High Speaker Naval's voice, when he spoke, was carefully controlled. You understand that what you are asking represents a fundamental. I understand exactly what I am asking, I said. I was in your chamber when you folded our flag. I watched the broadcast from the docking ring. I read every page of a report your committee spent 18 months compiling about us that no one ever let me see or respond to. I have been very clear-eyed about what this situation is. I need you to be clear-eyed about it too. I let that sit for a moment. Then I turned to the final page. Fifth. A new permanent seat on a restructured council, with full veto capability over any resolution affecting humanity's interests or territory. Non-transferable. Non-conditional. Written into the amended accord as a founding provision, not a granted privilege. The room was very quiet. One of the delegates I did not recognize, younger than the others, with the careful stillness of someone trying not to react, said, that would require a complete restructuring of the council's governance framework. Yes, I said. It would. You are asking us to remake the institution. I am asking you to fix it, I said. There is a difference. One implies starting from nothing. The other implies looking honestly at what went wrong and correcting it. The council is not beyond correction. But it is also not beyond being replaced, if correction is not possible. The Galaxy has now seen that an original accord signatory can build, in secret, a fleet of 412 vessels and maintain that secret for 6 years while passing 3 council audits. If the council's response to that information is to protect the institution as it currently exists rather than to examine why the institution created the conditions for that choice, then the institution has answered the question of whether it is worth protecting. High Speaker Naval looked at me for a long time. I did not look away, and I did not help him. He had not helped me when I was standing on the council floor trying to speak. He looked at the document in front of him. He looked at Yara, who had not said a word and had not needed to. He looked at the window, where the neutral station's transit corridors were visible below, ordinary life, continuing. Then he said, "How long do we have to review the terms?" "You have until this time tomorrow," I said. After that, I return to Earth, and the next communication from humanity to the Council will come through Philip Garrett's command channel. He nodded. It was a small movement, but it was the first time in the conversation that his head had moved in agreement rather than in the careful noncommittal motion of someone managing their reaction. The session closed without further negotiation. They needed the night to talk among themselves, and I gave it to them. We returned to our quarters on the station and I sat with Colin and Yara and Daniel in a small common room and we drank coffee and did not say very much, because there was not much left to say. Daniel asked me if I thought they would accept. I thought about it honestly. They don't have a better option, I said. Not because we have them cornered. Because the option they thought they had, the clean, fast resolution they planned when they commissioned that gravitational survey, fell apart. They needed it to be over quickly and quietly. It is not over, and it is not quiet. Every day that continues is a day more of the Galaxy reads the Extinction Protocol document and asks itself which side of that line it wants to be on. And the Dreen? Colin said. The Dreen said 11 words, I said. I think that is all they intended to say. But 11 words from the Dreen, in the right place, at the right time, carry more legal and historical weight than 11,000 from anyone else. They knew that. They chose to say it anyway. I slept well that night. For the first time in a long time. The Council's response came at 9 in the morning, an hour before my deadline. It was delivered in writing through the station's formal diplomatic office, addressed to me by name, not by title. That detail was not accidental. They were already beginning the process of treating me as something other than what their resolution had tried to make me. They accepted the terms. Not without conditions, there were 4 pages of proposed amendments to the language, the kind of careful legal cushioning that institutions put around agreements they find difficult to swallow. Daniel went through every one in 40 minutes, approved 2 minor phrasings as acceptable, and flagged the rest as attempts to soften commitments that were not going to be softened. I sent back a single page in response. The terms stood as written, with the 2 minor phrasings Daniel had approved incorporated. No further amendment. They signed at 2 in the afternoon. I transmitted the signed agreement to Earth, to every colony, to the Serati Merchant Combine, to the Umbral Cultural Council, and to the Dreen Communication Node. I did not transmit a message along with it. The document spoke for itself. What happened after the signing was not a celebration. Not on our end. There were celebrations elsewhere. I saw the feeds from Halcyon Station later, Lena Rose standing in the station's central corridor with several hundred of her neighbors, all of them quiet and tired and relieved in the way that people are relieved when something they knew was right turns out to actually be true. That was not celebration. That was vindication. Those are different things, and the difference matters. On Earth, in the facility where Yara and I had spent the past weeks working, the response was similarly subdued. People who had built Iron Cradle in the dark did not have a particular relationship with public acknowledgement. They had done the work because the work needed doing. It being over did not change why it had been done. Philip Garrett sent a brief message from the Mars perimeter. It said the 7th Arm would maintain position for 30 days pending the Vethra team's withdrawal from the outer colonies, then return to standard rotation. It said nothing about the engagement at the perimeter, nothing about the 11 minutes, nothing about the vessel that had not come home. Just the operational status and the plan. I filed my personal record for the historical archive 2 days after the signing. Not a diplomatic summary. Not an official report. A personal record, in my own words, of what I had seen and done and understood. I wrote it because history has a tendency to flatten events into their outcomes and forget the texture of how they happened, the specific weight of a folded flag, the specific sound of a muted microphone, the specific quality of quiet on Earth the day I came home and found a planet that had already decided what it was going to do. I wrote about Owen Bray not stopping. I wrote about Lena Rose's 4 sentences. I wrote about 6 years of iron built by people whose names will probably never appear in the formal history of these events because formal history is interested in outcomes and not in the labor that creates them. I wrote about Fana Rail picking up the document. I wrote about the Dreen's 11 words and what it meant that they had chosen to speak after so long, and what it implied about what they had been watching, and for how long, and with what conclusion. And I wrote about standing at the window of a docking ring and watching our flag get folded by hands that thought the folding was the end of something. It was not the end. It was a moment in the middle of something that had been building for years, and it was the moment that made the rest of it inevitable. You cannot fold a flag and expect the people it belongs to simply accept the lesson. Not when those people have been building, in the dark, in silence, for exactly the contingency you have just created. Iron Cradle began its decommissioning process 10 days after the agreement was signed. Not because we were surrendering the capability, the vessels remained commissioned, the crews remained trained, the manufacturing nodes remained intact and ready. Decommissioning, in this context, meant transitioning from active deployment to strategic reserve. Ready, but still. Present, but waiting. The new council seat was formally established 6 weeks later. I was not offered it. I had specifically declined to be considered. What I had done over the past months was a diplomatic function, and diplomacy was what I knew. The council seat required someone who wanted to build inside the institution rather than apply pressure from outside it. I recommended a woman named Claire Hadley, a former colony administrator from New Cairo who had been quietly furious about the council's action since the day she heard about the resolution, and who had the particular combination of patience and principle that the role would require. She accepted. She was good at it almost immediately, in the way that some people are suited to the work they find rather than the work they planned. I took a leave of absence from active diplomatic service. It was the first leave I had taken in 6 years and I was well past due. I spent most of it on a coast I had visited once before and barely remembered, watching the water and thinking about very little. On the last morning of the leave, I went out early before anyone else was around, and I stood at the edge of the water and I looked up at a sky that still had stars in it even in the growing light, and I thought about all of it from the beginning. The chamber. The muted channel. The folded flag. The drive to the facility in the dark, and Grace Holloway handing me a card and telling me the meeting had been planned for 18 months. Yara showing me a wall full of ship classifications that should not have existed. A cargo captain who did not stop. A mayor who wrote 4 sentences. 11 words from the oldest voice in the galaxy. And a fleet that held still because it had chosen to, not because it had stopped. I spoke aloud, because it felt like it deserved to be said out loud, even if there was nobody to hear it. They woke something up, I said to the water and the sky and the stars that were still barely there. I hope they understand now, it doesn't go back to sleep. The sun came up. The stars went quiet. I turned and walked back up the path, because there was more work ahead, and I had already rested enough.